Facebook Marketplace isn't my usual go-to for shopping, but sometimes it's worth a look when you want to save a buck. At the time, I was hunting for some affordable carpentry tools. New sets were outrageously expensive, and since I only dabble in woodworking as a hobby, I didn't see the need to splurge. After a few days of casual browsing, I stumbled across a listing for a complete drill and saw set at a fraction of the retail price. The listing was only posted a couple of hours earlier by someone named Diane. I messaged her immediately, expressing interest and asking if I could pick up the tools that evening. She replied promptly, saying she'd be home after 8 p.m. and provided an address. It was about 15 minutes away in a neighborhood I vaguely recognized because a coworker had once lived nearby. That evening, I pulled up to a small, unassuming house at the end of a quiet street. It looked a little worse for wear, but not out of place for the area. Peeling paint, an overgrown lawn, and dim porch lighting. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar, which struck me as odd. Not wanting to be rude, I knocked on the frame. After a moment, a man appeared. He looked to be in his mid-40s, wearing an old flannel shirt and jeans. I mentioned I was there to meet Diane about the tools. He nodded enthusiastically and invited me in, saying Diane was just finishing up in the back and would join us shortly. His demeanor was friendly enough, so I cautiously stepped inside. The living room was nearly barren, save for a large toolbox sitting on the floor. No couch, no photos, no decorations, just bare walls and dusty floors. The man noticed my hesitation and quickly explained that they were in the process of moving. He gestured toward the toolbox, saying it contained everything from the listing. I crouched to inspect the tools, but immediately noticed something was off. The drill was missing a key attachment, and a few saw blades were nowhere to be found. I asked if this was the complete set, as the listing photos had shown more. He hesitated, then gave a sheepish grin and said Diane might know where the rest of the pieces were. Feeling uneasy, I suggested he check with her. He hesitated again, as if weighing his options, before finally heading down a dark hallway. As soon as he disappeared from sight, I strained my ears to hear any signs of conversation. The house was silent. A sinking wave of dread washed over me. After what felt like an eternity, I walked toward the hallway and glanced down it. The man was just standing at the far end, staring at the wall. My pulse quickened. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was stalling. Heart pounding, I turned back toward the front door, trying to keep my movements calm. But as soon as I took a step, I heard him sprinting after me. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty house. Without looking back, I bolted out the door, jumped into my car, and sped off. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him run out onto the lawn, waving his arms frantically before disappearing around the side of the house. Shaking, I pulled over a few blocks away and called the police. After explaining the situation, they agreed to meet me at a nearby station for a formal statement. Hours later, an officer followed up, saying the address I'd visited was abandoned and had been vacant for nearly 2 years. Whatever was happening there wasn't legitimate. To this day, I don't know what the man's intentions were or what would have happened if I'd stayed longer. All I know is that I'll never trust a stranger's online listing again. My name is Grace, and I live in a small house on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a quiet little town surrounded by thick woods. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the streets are deserted by 8 p.m. Most nights, I love the peace and quiet. But that stormy night changed everything. The rain started early in the afternoon, steady at first, then turning into a relentless downpour by nightfall. Thunder rolled through the sky, rattling the windows, and the wind howled through the trees. I was curled up on the couch, watching a movie, trying to tune out the storm. The sound of rain pounding on the roof and the occasional flash of lightning made it feel cozy, at least at first. Around 9 p.m., just as I was getting into the movie, there was a knock at the door. It startled me so much that I jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone, and with the storm raging outside, it seemed odd that someone would be out in this weather. I paused the movie, my heart already racing, and stood up slowly. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please, ma'am," a man's voice answered, barely audible over the storm. My car broke down just up the road. I don't have a phone, and I'm soaked out here. Can I use yours? I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door lock. Through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch. He was drenched from head to toe, his clothes sticking to him, and his hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't have an umbrella or a jacket, just a desperate look on his face. "Where's your car?" I asked, keeping the door shut. "Just around the bend," he said, pointing behind him into the darkness. It stalled, and I couldn't get it started again. "Please, I just need to call for a tow truck." His voice was calm, but something about the situation felt off. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, Cedar Ridge was a safe place, and people helped each other here. But still, my gut told me to be cautious. "I'll grab my phone," I said through the door. "Wait here." I locked the door before walking to the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone. Instead of giving it to him, I decided I'd make the call myself. When I returned to the door, I cracked it open just enough to speak. "I'll call for you. What's the car look like?" The man frowned for a moment, but then nodded. "It's a black sedan, just before the big oak tree on the left. My name's Eric." I nodded and shut the door again, locking it quickly. I called the tow company and explained the situation. The woman on the line said it might take a while because of the storm, but assured me someone would come out as soon as possible. When I opened the door to let Eric know, he was gone. The porch was empty, rain pouring down in thick sheets. I leaned out, calling into the storm. "Hello, Eric?" There was no response. The sound of the rain drowned out everything else, making the world feel eerily quiet despite the storm. I stepped back inside, my nerves on edge. Maybe he'd gone back to his car to wait. That made sense, right? Still, something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, making sure they were secure. I even kept my phone in my hand as I walked through the house, glancing into each room. Everything seemed fine, but the uneasy feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. About an hour later, just as I was starting to relax, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was louder and more deliberate. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the house. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I approached the door. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling now. "It's Eric," the man said. "The tow truck never came. I think you gave them the wrong location." My stomach dropped. I knew I'd given the right spot. "I told them where to find you," I said, trying to sound confident. "Just wait by your car. They'll come." There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice lower and more frustrated. "Ma'am, I can't stand out here all night. Let me in so we can sort this out." I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. "No," I said firmly. "Go wait by your car." Another long pause. Then finally, I heard his footsteps moving away from the porch. I didn't relax, though. For the rest of the night, I kept checking the locks, glancing out the windows, and listening for any sound. The storm raged on outside, and every creak of the house made my heart race. By the time morning came, the rain had stopped, and sunlight streamed through the windows. I cautiously stepped outside, scanning the yard and the road beyond. There was no sign of Eric or his car. It was as if he'd never been there at all. That night was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. To this day, I don't know if he really needed help or if he had other intentions, but I trusted my instincts, and I'm glad I didn't open that door. A few years ago, when my daughter was a toddler, my wife and I had a favorite spot, a secluded lake nestled in a quiet, forested area about 30 minutes from our house. It was our escape, the kind of place where time slowed down and the world's noise seemed to fade away. One warm afternoon, we decided to head there for a picnic. We packed a small cooler, a blanket, and a few toys for our daughter, then set off. The lake was as beautiful as ever, its surface gleaming under the sunlight, surrounded by the rich green of the trees. After eating, our daughter played near the shore, splashing in the shallows, while my wife and I watched from the blanket. The air was warm, the setting serene, one of those rare moments where everything feels just right. After a while, my wife stood, brushing sand from her legs. "I think I'll take a quick swim," she said, smiling. "Go for it," I said, watching as she waded into the water. She moved gracefully, her figure reflecting in the ripples she created. I turned my attention back to our daughter, helping her pile wet sand into what she insisted was a castle. Then I heard my wife shout. I looked up, squinting against the sunlight. She was about 20 feet out, standing still, the water lapping at her waist. Her face was turned toward me, her hand shading her eyes. "What?" I called back, confused. Her voice carried over the water, shaky but clear. "I think I just stepped on someone's face." The words didn't register at first. I stared at her, half expecting her to laugh or smile, but she didn't. She was pale, her body tense, like she was rooted in place. Then, as if shaking off whatever held her there, she turned and began moving quickly back toward the shore. When she reached me, her hands were trembling. "What are you talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice calm so our daughter wouldn't pick up on the tension. She shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together, as if trying to convince herself it wasn't real. Finally, she said, "I felt something under my foot. It wasn't a rock or seaweed. It was soft. When I pressed down, I felt a nose and the hollow of an eye socket." Her voice broke on the last word. I glanced out at the lake. It was calm, the surface glittering innocently under the sun. My first instinct was to dismiss it as her imagination, a trick of the water or her nerves. But the look on her face stopped me. "Are you sure?" I asked. She nodded, swallowing hard. "It was a face. I know what I felt." I looked back at the water, unease prickling at the back of my neck. "I'll check it out," I said, stepping toward the shoreline. "No," she said, grabbing my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Don't. Please. Let's just go." I hesitated, torn between curiosity and the growing knot in my stomach. Finally, I nodded. "All right." We packed up quickly, the tension in the air thick and heavy. Our daughter chattered away, oblivious to the shift in mood, while my wife and I exchanged nervous glances. The drive home was silent. I wanted to ask her more, to press for details, but the haunted look in her eyes kept me quiet. For the next few days, neither of us brought it up. Life went on, though the memory lingered like a shadow. A week later, the news changed everything. I was scrolling through headlines on my phone when one caught my eye. "Local man found dead in lake, missing for 2 weeks." My stomach turned as I read the article. A man in his early 20s, missing since the beginning of the month, had been discovered in the same lake, our lake. The report said his body had been submerged near the center, hidden just beneath the surface. A kayaker had spotted something unusual and called the authorities. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. When I showed the article to my wife, she went pale. "That's him," she whispered. "That's who I stepped on." I tried to reassure her, though I wasn't sure what to say. The details in the article matched too well. The timeline, the location, it all lined up. That night, after putting our daughter to bed, we sat in the dim light of the living room, the silence stretching between us. "What do you think happened?" my wife finally asked, her voice small. I didn't know how to answer. To this day, I still think about that afternoon, about the man in the water, silent and unseen, just beneath the surface. And sometimes I wonder if we disturbed something that wasn't meant to be found. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. When I was around 11, I had one of those sick days where you're not sick enough to stay in bed, but just unwell enough to miss school. I was sprawled out on the couch, watching cartoons, a blanket draped over me, and a mug of lukewarm tea on the coffee table. It was a gray, dreary day, kind where time seems to stretch forever. The only sounds were the occasional hum of passing cars and the faint chatter of the television. Then, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my mom wasn't due back from work until late afternoon. Still, I slid off the couch, shuffled to the door, and peeked through the small window. Standing there was a man in a mailman's uniform, holding a clipboard. He had a cap pulled low over his face, shadowing his features. Something about him made my stomach twist, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Hey there," he said with a wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Got a package for you guys, but it's a big one. Need some help carrying it in. It's really heavy, and I don't have all day, you know? You don't want me to leave this out here, do you?" He adjusted his grip on the clipboard and leaned closer. "Come on, it's just one box. You look like a strong kid. Won't take more than a minute." I hesitated, gripping the doorframe. "Where's your truck?" I asked, craning my neck to look past him. The street was empty, no postal truck in sight. He hesitated, then pointed vaguely over his shoulder. "It's just around the corner. Didn't want to block anything. You can come check if you don't believe me." His tone shifted, now slightly impatient. "Look, kid, I'm doing you a favor here. You think I want to carry this thing all by myself?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, coaxing tone. "It'll only take a second. You're a strong kid, right?" "Oh, it's just around the corner," he said, waving vaguely behind him. Didn't want to block the driveway. That didn't make sense. Our driveway wasn't anywhere near the street. My mom always parked in the garage. My heart started to pound. "Where's Mr. Lenny?" I asked. Mr. Lenny was our regular mailman, a cheerful guy who always handed out lollipops. The man's smile faltered, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. "Look, kid, I already told you he's on vacation. I'm filling in. What's with all the questions? Just open the door and help me out. It's not rocket science." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over the window. "You're not scared, are you? Come on, be a good kid." He stepped closer, his voice turning sharper. "You don't want to make your mom upset, do you? She wouldn't like that." The man's smile faltered for a split second. "He's visiting family. I'm filling in for him." My gut screamed at me that something was wrong. My mom's warnings about strangers echoed in my head. I'm not allowed to leave the house," I stammered. "My mom can pick it up from the post office later." The man's face darkened, his smile vanishing entirely. "Come on, kid. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Your mom wouldn't want you to waste my time like this. I've got other deliveries to make." His voice grew colder, the friendly facade slipping away. "Just open the door already. You're not going to make me wait out here all day, are you?" I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to get my shoes from upstairs first. Wait here." Before he could respond, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were trembling as I bolted through the house, locking the back door and every window I could reach. My heart was racing, my breaths coming in short gasps. Then I grabbed the phone and dialed Mrs. Kramer, but there was no answer. Panic surged through me as I realized she wasn't home. Desperate, I called another neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, who lived a few blocks away. He was an old family friend and always said to call if we ever needed anything. "Mr. Jenkins," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's a man at the door. He says he's the mailman, but he's not. Please come over, please." His voice turned sharp and serious. "Stay inside and lock everything. I'll be there as fast as I can." I hung up and crept back to the front door. The man was still there, pacing now, his movements jerky and agitated. When he saw me through the window, his demeanor changed entirely. He leaned in close, his face almost pressed against the glass, and tapped it lightly with his knuckles. "What's the holdup, kid? You don't want me to get mad, do you?" His tone was sharp now, the edge of a threat unmistakable. "I'm trying to do you a favor here. Open the door." "Did you find your shoes?" he called, his voice louder now, more insistent. I swallowed hard and forced my voice to sound calm. "I called my neighbor to help. She's older and stronger. She'll be here any second." His reaction was immediate. He froze for a split second, then turned on his heel and bolted down the driveway. I watched as he disappeared down the street, his figure swallowed by the gray afternoon. My legs felt like jelly, but I stayed rooted to the spot, staring out the window until Mr. Jenkins arrived, his face pale and worried. The police came and took my statement, but there wasn't much to go on. They searched the neighborhood but found no sign of him. No truck, no package, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside the window sent my heart racing. I kept replaying the moment in my head, wondering what would have happened if I had opened that door. Who was he? What did he really want? And most chilling of all, did he ever trick another kid into opening the door? Even now, the memory lingers. I've told myself he was just a con artist, but deep down, I know there was something darker. His smile, his persistence, it felt predatory. And I'll never forget it. It began with a wrong turn. I was driving home from a friend's house late at night, my GPS struggling to find a signal in the rural back roads. The twists and turns all looked the same, and I kept thinking I'd find a main road if I just kept going. But instead, the road narrowed, The trees thickened, and the night seemed to close in around me. That's when I saw the van. It was parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing faintly. A man stood by the driver's side, waving one arm in the air. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but the frantic movement of his arm made me hesitate. I slowed down, unsure whether to stop or keep driving. I eased my car to a crawl and rolled down the passenger side window just a crack. "You okay?" I called out. The man stepped closer, his features coming into focus in my headlights. His face was pale and unshaven, his eyes restless and darting. "Car trouble," he said gruffly, motioning toward the van. "Can you give me a ride to the next gas station?" I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to say no. Something about him felt wrong. His hunched shoulders, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides, and most of all, the way his eyes seemed to flick back toward the van as if checking for something. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, forcing a polite tone. "I can't." For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me. Then his expression shifted. His mouth tightened, his brows furrowed, and his eyes hardened into something cold and sharp. "Can't," he repeated, his voice dropping an octave. I'm in a rush," I stammered, gripping the steering wheel. His lips twisted into a sneer, and his shoulders tensed. For a second, I thought he might lunge at the car. "You can't spare 5 minutes," he snapped, his voice rising. "I'm sorry," I said again, louder this time, and rolled up the window. My heart was hammering as I pressed the accelerator, watching him shrink in my rearview mirror. His face, twisted with anger, was the last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed him. That should have been the end of it. About 10 minutes later, headlights appeared behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. The road had to lead somewhere, and I figured it was another late-night driver. But the lights stayed there, close enough to make me uneasy but far enough to avoid suspicion. I glanced in the mirror again. The shape of the vehicle looked familiar. It was a van. A chill ran down my spine. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the wheel. It couldn't be the same one. He'd been broken down. But the creeping sense of unease returned, and with every mile, it grew stronger. I slowed down slightly to let the van pass. Instead, it slowed too, keeping the same distance behind me. My stomach twisted into knots. I pressed on the accelerator, my car surging forward. The van sped up to match. My breathing quickened, and panic began to take hold. I was sure now. It was him. He must have gotten the van running somehow, and now he was following me. Up ahead, a gas station loomed like a beacon in the darkness. I swerved into the lot, parking as close to the entrance as possible. The van sped past without stopping, its taillights disappearing into the night. I bolted inside, my pulse pounding in my ears. The harsh fluorescent lights and hum of the refrigerator units were a strange comfort. A bored-looking cashier barely glanced up from his phone as I approached. "Hey," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Can I use your phone? Someone's been following me." The cashier frowned and pointed to a dusty landline on the counter. I picked it up, but the line was dead. "It's out of order," he said with a shrug. I sank into one of the plastic chairs by the window, keeping my eyes on the parking lot. Minutes passed, and there was no sign of the van. I tried to convince myself I was safe, but when I finally worked up the courage to leave, my blood ran cold. The van was parked across the street, its engine idling. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned back to the cashier, my voice trembling. "He's still out there." The cashier frowned, this time looking genuinely concerned. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight. Together we stepped outside. The van was gone. "Probably just a coincidence," the cashier muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. I wasn't taking any chances. I thanked him and got into my car, driving off as fast as I could. For a while, the road was empty, and I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing. Then the headlights appeared again. This time, the van didn't keep its distance. It surged forward, tailgating me so closely I could see its front grille in my rearview mirror. My hands trembled on the wheel as I tried to focus on the road. The van swerved to the left, then the right, as if trying to force me off the road. I spotted an exit and took it without thinking, hoping to lose him in the maze of streets. The van followed, its headlights casting long, menacing shadows across the empty buildings. Finally, I spotted a narrow alley and turned into it, killing my lights and holding my breath. The van roared past, its engine fading into the distance. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw it. In my side mirror, the van had reversed and was now blocking the alley's entrance. My chest tightened as the driver's side door creaked open. The man stepped out, his face twisted with fury. It was the same guy. His eyes locked onto mine through the windshield, and a cruel smile spread across his face. He walked toward my car, slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. I fumbled with the locks, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the button. Just as he reached my door, I heard the satisfying click of the locks engaging. He yanked the handle, his face inches from the glass. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled, pounding on the window. "You think you can just drive away?" I didn't answer. My eyes darted to the gear shift, and I slammed the car into reverse. The impact rattled me to the core as I hit the van, shoving it back just enough to squeeze through the gap. I didn't stop driving until I reached a police station miles away. When they went to check the alley, the van was gone. I still see his face sometimes, twisted in anger, every time I glance in my rearview mirror. Shortly after my son was born, my then-husband and I bought a 100-year-old house. It was charming in that creaky, character-filled way old houses are, with warped floorboards, drafty windows, and a yard bordered by looming, ancient trees. The house came with its quirks: a back gate that wouldn't stay shut, radiant heat that hissed and clanged like a living thing, and the occasional unsettling knock or thump in the night. I told myself it was just the house settling, but it never stopped unnerving me. When my husband and I split, I kept the house. He took the dog, leaving just me, my son, and the shadowy noises of the old place. At night, the house felt larger, lonelier, the creaks grew louder, and yet I stayed. Life went on. One night, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, my son and I curled up on the couch to watch a movie. It was one of those rare, peaceful evenings, the kind that made me think maybe this house and I could coexist. But when my phone died mid-movie, I remembered my one and only charger was in the kitchen. Grumbling at my lack of foresight, I left my son and made my way toward the back of the house. As I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. Through the kitchen window, I spotted the back gate wide open. My breath caught in my throat. The gate, that damn gate. I could have sworn it was shut earlier. But that wasn't all. Sitting in the yard cross-legged was a figure. A man, or maybe a woman, cloaked in a hood and wearing dark sunglasses despite the fading light. A cigarette hung loosely from their gloved hand, the faint ember glowing against the dusk. I suddenly felt exposed, remembering that the kitchen windows were bare, the curtains having been removed earlier in the week for washing. Had they been watching us? How long had they been there, hidden in the growing shadows? I locked the back door in a hurry, though it felt like a flimsy shield against the wrongness radiating from the yard. Grabbing my phone and the charger, I fled to the dining room. My hands trembled as I plugged in the phone, praying it would turn on quickly. I messaged the first friend I saw online, telling them what I'd seen and begging them to call the police if they didn't hear back soon. It was the longest wait of my life. My son wandered in, asking for water, and I fumbled through an excuse about why we couldn't go back to the kitchen. When the phone finally came to life, I dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm, asking me questions I barely comprehended. "Can you check to see if they're still there?" Without being seen if possible. I didn't want to, but something in her voice, steady and soothing, compelled me. I crept back to the kitchen, crouching low. The door was locked. Relief flickered for a moment. Then I noticed the dog door, a large gaping hole in the bottom of the door. It had no cover, no way to block it off. Panic surged. I straightened slightly to look out the window, and there they were. Right there, the hood, the sunglasses. Their face remained unnervingly still, turned toward the house. The cigarette burned down slowly between their fingers. They didn't move, not an inch, not a shift of their posture. They were as still as a statue, an unyielding presence that sent chills racing through me. The dispatcher urged me to grab my son and lock ourselves in a room. I scrambled back to him, shaking, and carried him upstairs to the bathroom. I sat with him on the floor, clutching him tightly, my ears straining for any sound from downstairs. When the police arrived, I watched from my neighbor's house as the officers entered the yard. Minutes later, They led the figure away. A woman, they said. She offered no resistance and no explanation. She simply followed them out, as calm and quiet as she had been in the yard. That night, I boarded up the dog door, but I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Had she been watching us earlier when we had no curtains? Had she come here before and I just never noticed? What kind of person does this? I wondered. Who sits in someone's yard without saying a word, motionless, just staring? My mind spiraled into theories. Maybe they were some kind of lunatic, someone detached from reality. Or maybe this was their version of entertainment, scaring strangers by showing up uninvited and unresponsive.